So, John, we're delighted that you're here and you took time out of your busy life, both interning for Judge Connors and going to law school, to tell us about your background and handling conflict.
Yeah, so I just wrote some stuff, so we'll put it right here. But yeah, as Sally said, my name is John Petoskey. I'm a law student at the University of Michigan. So dnes se odmah Indigenous class, Michigan go down, get your go down, sing and Odawa and Dao. So my name that was gifted to me when I was a young boy is The Thunder Rolls In. And I'm a turtle fan, which are people in my community who are generally fishermen, people who tend to have big ideas, things like that. And my tribe is the Ottawa tribe. So we generally introduce ourselves by saying our name that was gifted to us, our clan, where we're from, and our tribe. And I'm from Shawitan, Michigan, which is on the Dulin Peninsula, north of Traverse City, and in our language it's called Kichibig Wadangsing, which means like a big bay, essentially. So Grand Traverse Bay. So my connection to the DRC and peacemaking, as I said, is through Judge Connors at the Washtenaw County Circuit Court. I interned for him throughout all of last year, and I no longer intern for him, but we remain to be very good friends, and I still enjoy coming around to events like this because I think peacemaking is a very valuable tool to cultivate both within the court system and just in life in general. So peacemaking, as many of you probably know, is a different type of dispute resolution, and it has its roots in Native American forms of dispute resolution. And so Sally just asked me to come today to talk to you about my tribe and how we resolve disputes traditionally and how that's reflected today in our tribal court system or reflected in other forms such as the system that is employed here at the DRC or Washtenaw County Court. So you can't really talk about any of this without first just talking about history. And so the dispute resolution model that is adopted by a lot of Indigenous communities is not adversarial. The model is based upon letting everybody in a circle give their opinion, respecting everyone's viewpoint, and trying to reach an outcome that benefits all involved. And so this difference in the two models of dispute resolution has its roots in the differences between how power, political power and authority is acquired and maintained in Indigenous societies versus how it's acquired and maintained in Anglo-American and European societies. So today in the United States, the government holds authority over how disputes are resolved. So a judge, an arbiter, a mediator, comes before a group of people who are having a dispute and makes a decision about how to resolve that dispute. And this power, as many of you know, comes from a social contract between citizens and the government in which citizens respect the power of the government to decide what is best. And this decision is based on law, it's based on social norms. Deviating from the law results in the government coming in and making a decision for you. And so I mean, this is really rooted in divine right. Like the crown in England got its power from God itself, and that's the ultimate authority. And so the best way to describe this is that it's authority through compulsion. We don't get to decide if we want to follow the law. We have to, otherwise the government will get involved and compel you to follow the law. And so Indigenous, and this is a vertical organization of governance. And so Indigenous societies and the Indigenous societies in Michigan, on the other hand, were organized more horizontally. And so people led through persuasion and not compulsion. So in Michigan, Indian societies were in Anishinaabe societies. So Anishinaabe, just for reference, are the Three Fires Council, and that's the Ottawa tribe, the Ojibwe tribe, and the Potawatomi tribe. And so the way that these communities were socially ordered was under a clan system. And so there are 7 different clans, and each clan has its own role inside of the community. And everyone is dependent on the role of each clan. So everyone is dependent on each other for resources, for survival. And a form of this continues today, even though many people in indigenous communities have more or less incorporated into the greater culture of the United States. We still depend on each other for a lot, for familial support, for emotional support, for if you need somebody to watch your kids, you can call up somebody who you're not even related to and they'll help you out. I mean, I was raised in a community where I really had 20 different mothers and 20 different fathers. And so this interdependence on one another facilitated a different type of dispute resolution in which everybody, when a dispute arose, it was not, there was no utility in having someone win and somebody else lose, because having anybody lose affected the entire community because of the interdependence of the community tasks. And so really, peacemaking in indigenous communities wasn't something that we woke up one day and said, we're going to do this. It was more just something that grew naturally because that is how we were socially organized. There was no benefit of having a loser and a winner. There was benefit in having reconciliation, benefit in having forgiveness, and benefit in having good arise out of a dispute, having learning arise out of a dispute. So this difference in social organization is really at the heart of I think what peacemaking is trying to accomplish, in that it's trying to accomplish dispute that is resolved through compromise, through forgiveness, and to create an environment of reconciliation. So a lot of this stuff is kind of abstract, so I thought I'd just bring it in a little bit. So in Michigan today, tribal courts have are adversarial. I mean, there are 2 sides to disputes, and judges often do decide how those disputes are resolved. But for crimes or even civil mediation that is somewhat low level and that doesn't really need a judge to decide it, where if it's just some petty crime, like a kid stealing something out of someone's house, like they're stealing money out of their aunt's purse or something like that. And like I said before, I mean, even if I as a child were to steal money out of a woman's purse in my community, that would be like stealing from my own family. So there would be no utility in punishing me for that when that person is related to me. So I mean, it was a way to foster a better community, not punish people for interfamilial disputes. And I mean, it's not the case in a lot of social situations like in Washington County, and not everybody is related. But there are certain techniques that can be drawn from this model that are being applied at places like the DRC. And the main one is just the incorporation of values into the peacemaking circle. So in my community, we incorporate the 7 grandfather teachings into our dispute resolution model. And the 7 grandfather teachings are love, respect, wisdom, honesty, truth, bravery, and wisdom. And these teachings are rooted in our culture and in the mediation ceremonies, which are the traditional religion of my tribe. And so whenever we come into a peacemaking circle, each person starts out by saying what these values mean to them and how they would want these values reflected in whatever outcome may be produced by the circle. And so in the same vein, a place like Skyline High School or Washington County or University of Michigan or anywhere can have a set of core values that influence how they decide to resolve a dispute. And it differs for certain sets of people, for populations. And so I think the most important step in peacemaking, and this is something I've learned from Judge Connors and from Belinda and from many people involved in peacemaking and dispute resolution and restorative justice, is that it really needs to be about the people who are affected by the dispute. And that really is the same as Indigenous dispute resolution. We're all affected by a dispute, affected by a conflict, because you're all interrelated. And so on a grand scale, it is really the same in the United States. You are affected by the outcomes that are received by your fellow citizens. So I'll just say in closing, I guess, that I leave you with a value that I hold dear, that I always bring with me to peacemaking circles and to conflicts whenever they arise. And it's one of the 7 grandfather teachings, and my favorite one. So it's in Wakuin, which is wisdom. And many people coming into peacemaking will choose teaching like love, truth, honesty, and then wisdom doesn't get as much love, but Wakuin is my favorite one. And because I think it's important to, and the word Wakuin in my language doesn't necessarily mean wisdom, it means patience, it means the ability to reconcile, it means the ability to push aside your pride or push aside your intelligence and really have the wisdom to absorb other people's values, to see yourself in another. And so when I come to a conflict that is filled with very serious emotional pain, misunderstanding, where people aren't seeing eye to eye, I think it is really important to have the wisdom to be patient, have the wisdom to see from another's perspective, and have the wisdom to know that no matter how bad a situation may seem at one point, it is resolvable through compromise, through reconciliation, through forgiveness, through talking to one another, through having the patience to talk to one another, and having the wisdom to know that everybody really deserves justice and happiness, and that we're all interrelated. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you. Yeah, I'll answer questions as well if you have any.
I'm curious how it is that your tribe, for instance, but I think you were implying that, that it's sort of common in Native American communities, that you've moved to using more of a Western kind of court structure and use the circles for lower level crime or whatever. Do you know why that happened?
Well, I guess it's a multifaceted answer. The easy one to say is colonialism. The more difficult answer is in the 1940s, there was an act passed by Congress called the Indian Reorganization Act. And that act essentially allowed tribes to reestablish themselves as sovereign governments. But the model constitution that the IRA put forth modeled into tribal governments a judiciary that was reflective of Western judiciaries. And so in order to have self-determination, a lot of tribes were compelled to adopt Western judiciary models. And so it just became the system. And I mean, I don't mean to, I personally, as someone who's in law school, have a great respect for the adversarial system. And I think that the common law does serve a lot of functions, and it structures our lives. But I don't think it can solve every problem. So, and peacemaking can't solve every problem either. And I think the middle ground is really where we want to be. And that's what tribes have come to recognize in the past few years, is that the adversarial model that they've adopted in the 1940s under the IRA, it was not, their communities didn't respond as well as they could have. So it did offer some benefit, but, and which is why we still have it. Because in the world that we live in now, in the America that we live in now, Indian tribes don't occupy a lot of space. We're surrounded, the community I live in, for example, is surrounded by non-Indian communities, non-Indian law, non-Indian court systems, and so there's some benefit in having that reflected in your own tribal government, just for purposes of cohesiveness with the community around you. But that's not to say that peacemaking doesn't also have a place within your community. So I think that, I don't know if that answers your question. But,
Yeah, I
yeah.
just didn't know if there was a sort of a residual grief at the community level about having lost, you know, the dispute resolving model and having something else forced on.
I mean, I don't think it ever went away. I think people have resolved disputes like this within their families, regardless of, and that's why it still exists, because it never went away. It just wasn't. It wasn't at the level of government that it is today, and it's being incorporated into the Western-style governments that we've been forced to adopt. And that's the difference, really, because it's starting to be recognized by the tribe as well as by county systems, state systems, federal systems.
Smith? I'm wondering if you could talk about an example of what might go to peacemaking and how it would get convened and what it would look like?
Sure. So I mean, my tribe actually, we had a peacemaking court for 5-6 years, I think. But we no longer have a peacemaking court just because of intertribal or politics and things like that. But the same struggles that I think the DRC faces in a lot of respects, with some institutional resistance here. But there are other tribes in Michigan that do continue to have peacemaking circles. In our tribe, things that go to peacemaking are interfamilial disputes that that shouldn't really need to go to a court system. My community, for example, has 1,200 people in it, and we have a full-fledged government that is elected by the community, a court system to govern 1,200 people. And so when there were situations that arose where two brothers would fight at a party, and one would seriously injure the other one, rather than have, that is a severe crime, but if they both opted to go to peacemaking, they could. And so rather than discuss the severity of the crime or discuss what happened the night that they got into a fight, you would instead assess the underlying reasons for it and try to foster reconciliation between them rather than retribution against one of them. And so when you enter a circle, each person says a value that they want to bring in. And most people say one of the 7 grandfather teachings. I always say wisdom. And then you just say why. Because those things mean different things to different members of the community. And the model is basically, so you'd be sitting, say we're sitting here, and we'd smudge so that you light this sacred medicine, so it's sage, cedar, sweetgrass, and tobacco, and you light it inside of this shell. Then each person smudges, and then you take an eagle feather, and the first person talks and tells why they bring the value that they set at the beginning into the circle. And then each person goes around and says their value.
And who would be in the circle?
So it would be the 2 brothers who are fighting, a community representative, perhaps an auntie, a religious leader, or somebody they work for, or somebody that they both trust, and then there would be like a facilitator of the circle. And traditionally, this person would be an elder, someone in the community who is well respected, and who has been in the community for a long time. But today, I mean, it could be anybody. And these take place informally a lot, where you get together and you have a talking circle to talk about a community problem. And so you take an eagle feather and each person says why they brought their value. Each person says how they were affected by what happened. And then you just keep going around and it just flows naturally. I mean, and each person gets to say how they feel about what other people said, how they feel about a dispute that happened or how they feel about what is happening in the community currently until you reach some type of resolution. And so there's not really one, in Indigenous communities, there's not one outcome that you're looking for. I mean, it's tailored to whatever the dispute really is. And so, I mean, another example that is a bit more broad outside of like interpersonal disputes is recently in my community, there was a major scandal with our tribal chairman, and it affected the community in a deeply emotional way, and he is in prison now because of what he did.
Financial?
Not financial. It was a criminal act that he committed, and it really caused a really large rift in the community. People who supported him, people who did not support him. And one way that that people have been trying to ameliorate this issue is just by talking about it using this forum, because it's such a contentious and deeply emotional issue, because people were related to him, people were related to his victims, and so by having the patience to just go around and have everybody say their perspective is in and of itself a very valuable thing to do. And so, I mean, I'm not really sure if I answered your question to your liking.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I mean, there's not one form for doing peacemaking.
Mine is just a comment, which is, I really like your description of community, because some of the reading on peacemaking and some of the training on peacemaking that I've had hasn't focused on the variety of definitions of community. And the part of the peacemaking process itself is, in the beginning, to kind of recognize the emotional piece of being in a community. Whether it's a classroom, or a family, or a neighborhood. I think that's really very catchy.
Thank you.
One thing that does, I'm familiar with your community, and that is taking time. These things take time.
Yes.
And we, the Westerners, we want to get this thing over with and resolved. And that's the last thing that's on your mind. It takes as long as it takes.
And that's a very good point. And expediency often doesn't allow for the best resolution.
That's right.
Yeah.
I heard recently that sometimes tribes resolve conflict by playing lacrosse. Is that?
I mean, not my tribe. We were lacrosse players. I know the Iroquois. Yeah, they used to. It actually, this is an interesting little tidbit. Lacrosse was not played how it is now, and in the Iroquois communities, which were our traditional enemies. So, but anyway, yeah, when they had intertribal conflicts between people in New England, that's where their tribes were. They would play lacrosse until the other team was so exhausted that they couldn't play anymore.
And everybody would accept that as the win, or whatever the issue was. I thought that was good.
We do that in mediation, we mediate till we're all exhausted.
Yeah.
Don't we do that? Yeah.
So, any other questions?
All right, well, did you
Can I
have
just
a...
make a comment?
Yeah.
Okay. I think one of the things, so just thinking of it from a training perspective, as Susan suggested, we have set in quite a few training days. And sometimes I wonder what were we doing, in a training. But one of the things I have learned to value, recognize, and just accept that it's not such a linear process that happens. It's just bringing people together, and it's so organic that I think we're still trying to wrap our brains around how can something so organically happening really get us to an end goal of resolution. So one of the things that I've been working with Belinda on is just having that patience in the, and taking that risk of waiting to see what will happen. What will happen, what needs to happen will happen. And that is such a very different mindset in how we do things. Everything else in my life has a very clearly defined outcome. If I do these things and put these things together, I'll get the cookie at the end. But in this work, it's such a complete difference in how I think about people. What needs to happen will happen because they will work together to get an outcome that they are so satisfied with. And sometimes we're wondering, what was that, you know? But I've learned to really appreciate that just in spending additional, you know, just having the opportunity to go and spend some additional time at the peacemaking court, meeting other tribal peacemakers. And they reinforce that don't get stuck on steps in the linear approach to life. That is really not what we do. And they don't. You know, dinner will happen when it needs to happen, and we will eat. And it's not a whole lot of planning and thinking. So it's just a shift, I think, and a difference in how the two communities do things. So that was my comment.
Very true.